The chapter on predation is half predation, half herbivory. I'm not very concerned with the sections of that chapter that are on mathematical models for predation, because if that's something that's going to become important to you, you'll be taking an advanced course and you'll be able to deal with it with appropriate software. So I don't find it that informative. What I am very interested in is that you understand the concepts about predation, and in particular, the factors that drive changes in population, changes in prey populations and in predator populations in that interplay. Let me start by saying that I will show you two classic examples in ecology of predation, and both of the classic examples are sort of right and sort of wrong. The part that's wrong, which has been subsequently worked out, is that in the real world, it's very rare that you would have a situation where a single prey and a single predator populations, single prey and single predator population, I don't know how to do that. A single prey and a single predator population each depends upon the other exclusively. That's how that sentence is supposed to work. I was having trouble getting the verb-subject agreement. So usually, you can't say, oh, this single factor causes a population to go up and down. Even in cases where they're very close, obviously there's going to be other environmental factors. It's not uncommon to see cycles in which there's a repeating nature to the relationship between species. And that, I think, is there to drive people crazy, because you spend lifetimes trying to figure out why the cycle exists the way it exists. And I'll give you some concrete examples of that. What should you take away from this? I'm going to introduce a number of terms, and for the rest of your life as a biologist, you'll be expected to know those terms without thinking. And so know those terms without thinking. And I'll explain which ones they are. And if you have confusion about it, ask me. Question me. I'll give you more examples, what have you. There's really two sides to this predation question. The first side is just, what do we see in terms of relationships between predator and prey? The second side is, what do prey do to try to prevent getting eaten? We think of predator and prey, or if you prefer, predators and herbivores, as being exclusively one way or the other. And there's lots of examples of species that are exclusively predaceous or exclusively herbivorous. However, in the real world, that's more flexible. And so species that we know are exclusively one way or the other are not really exclusively one way or the other. If you do a YouTube search on deer eating mouse, you can find examples of deer eating small mammals. I'm not sure I know why they do it, but it's documented they do that. You certainly can see, if you have a domestic cat, many of you have domestic cats, know they'll eat grass or whatever. I always assumed this was to torture us so they had something to throw up, but I assume that there's some other purpose to it. So feeding preferences are not necessarily as restrictive as we think, even though most of the calories are going to come from one source or another. What are the biochemical barriers to these sorts of things? Well, you have to have the ability to digest proteins, and in case of having being a predator, you're taking in a lot of nitrogen. And so you better be able to get rid of that excess nitrogen very efficiently. We are a good example, those of us who are pasty-faced and white-skinned in particular, are a good example of how very minor changes genetically can have a big difference in a species' ability to occupy a habitat and so forth. Now, I don't know that it's strictly true that the genes are linked, but the gene for white skin tends to go in parallel with the gene for retaining lactose in the adult stage. And that became important for those humans who settled in mostly Northern Europe, but lesser degree Southern Europe, because most of their calories came from milk products. And so those of us who have that trait and have that ancestry, without that retention of lactose in the adult stage, probably would have starved to death. And we can speculate that the modification in the regulatory genes that allowed that trait to persist, probably the people who had it lived and everybody else died, and then they reproduced. The white skin is associated with vitamin D, right? If you're in an area with a lot of winter, you have vitamin D deficiencies, and apparently having the white skin improves your ability to get vitamin D, even though it means you run a good risk of getting cancer in the summer from not having protected skin. So the point of that story is nutritional preferences aren't locked in stone. There's variation, and the variation can be associated in everything from the enzymes that are used for digestion, but also the behavioral traits and those features that determine what you eat. Just the topic of nutrition and behaviors associated with nutrition is kind of beyond the scope of the class. But there is an entire subdiscipline of ecology called nutritional ecology, which deals with nothing more than selection, evolution of how organisms feed, how that changes their entire ecology and has shaped their evolution. For my group of organisms, the insects, we can see very strange things. You can watch insects die to death on a plant that's perfectly acceptable as food. And by the same token, you'll see them eat things that will kill them. And there's a lot of behavioral flexibility. It's also true for most of the plant-feeding insects, at least those with chewing mouth parts, let's say the larvae. They will turn cannibalistic at high enough population densities. So maybe not, and there are such a thing as predaceous caterpillars. There's a relatively primitive group of butterflies that are actually predaceous. And to freak you out next time you're in the tropics, and I believe it's exclusive to South America, there are some blood-feeding moths. They actually use their stylet to penetrate, and a few that will feed on what are called lacrimal secretions. Lacrimal means, I don't know what lacrimal means, but it's the fluid in the eye. And so they come and they feed on fluids at the eye, and at least in cattle, they can actually scrape the cornea in the process of doing that. So even in a lineage, so we think of the ancestor of the moths and butterflies as being exclusively herbaceous. Even in that lineage, they jump. And no, Phyllis was telling me this morning she has to teach her students, she's doing an evolution unit, and she has to teach about mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are a good example of how successful you can be if you're willing to just go on a different diet. In the case of mosquitoes, their ancestors were feeding on plant juices, and they must have had some variation in behavior so that they would stick their proboscis not just in plant stems and something else. And by virtue of being able to feed on blood, they got a phenomenally good nitrogen-rich source, so they radically can increase their egg production. We can see this with existing mosquito species, that they can produce maybe a handful of eggs if they only have carbs, but if you give them a blood meal, there suddenly produces batches of hundreds. And it's a testament to how good the mosquitoes are in having made that switch and having radiated and having different species, that then they became associated with so many diseases. And it's essentially the microbes taking advantage of this really great system. Okay. Yeah, Maya?
Sorry, so in those cases, would like protein and nitrogen be like the limiting factor, and then so you like got past that limiting factor?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a good example in talking about carrying capacity, or R, for instance. So nitrogen can be a big limitation for R. The availability of protein to a species may be an absolute limit to how much it can reproduce. And what you would expect to happen is, it's not so much that a species starts feeding on blood and it suddenly has a huge growth. No, it has a growth. That leads to further selection then for species that can better do this. And so we can see all this in mosquitoes because they don't have a single trait. It's not just that they can digest the blood and use the nitrogen. They changed one of their enzymes into an anesthetic. They have an enzyme that they inject in us that's an anticoagulant. They have an anti-inflammatory they put in there. So we know there's a whole series of these events. And from a human standpoint, it's unfortunate that vertebrates are so similar because they didn't evolve all those traits to attack humans, but they carry right over from whatever other organism they did evolve in. That was a good question, Maya, thank you. I'm mostly going to show you stuff here on the computer, so excuse me for sitting down during the lecture. But we start with two absolutely standard, you must know it if you're in ecology, examples. And I'll show you, this is your book, if I can get to the right page. Let me go up here. There we go. These guys. So snowshoe hare and lynx. That's a lynx, cute cat, right? I suppose the snowshoe hare is cute as well. The reason that snowshoe hare and lynx have been such an important example in ecology has to do with availability of data. And to backtrack a little bit, do you remember when I was talking about population growth and I mentioned these guys, Lockett and Volterra, who did the yeast experiments? If I remember correctly, and I might be wrong on this, they also did predation experiments, and I think they used Hydra. The Hydra, the tentacled multicellular small thing. But I might be wrong. But anyway, they did some models in the laboratory and predicted how changes in prey should influence changes in predator populations. But the lynx snowshoe hare turned out to be a real world example that people latched onto. And in large measure, they latched onto it because that system behaved the way we thought it should behave. That's not to say that what was done with those is wrong. It's just that it was kind of a pure example that it's relatively unusual to see in the natural world. And then, of course, as people study it, it wasn't nearly as pure as we thought to begin with. Let's see if I can find stuff. I'll post these for you, but where did I put it? No. Maybe it's, I don't think it's this. Yeah, it's this one. Okay. This chart, which I apologize, is, can't look at the wrong way. It's not really necessary that you read it. What matters is that this is 17480, I think, and this is, I think, in the 1800s. So, Hudson's Bay Company in Canada, and there's a picture of that here, I believe. Yeah, so Hudson's Bay Company in Canada had been trading for lynx furs since the 1700s. And because of that, they had records of how many furs were brought in each different area. And so if you can find the records, most of which were extant, you could go back and see how lynx populations varied over something like a 200-year period. And let me say, there's very few things very few organisms you can find that have any sort of record of abundance like that. Although there are data from China on grasshopper outbreaks there are over 1,000 years of data points, which is pretty cool. So this is available. This paper was published in the 40s. And really what matters is, I think it's here in your book, is what is the relationship between lynx numbers and snowshoe hare numbers? And the answer is given by a chart, which I'm looking for right there. And what we see is this. Whoops. Well, we'd see it if I didn't scroll to the next page. Cyclic fluctuations in the population of snowshoe hares and lynx. So you'll always see these data expressed this way. One axis is the number of prey species. The other axis is the number of predator species. In this, the prey are in green and the predator are in red. So take a look at it and tell me what conclusions you draw from that, other than they go up and down. And the answer is you should draw two conclusions. First conclusion, which is obvious, they go up and down together, right? The more important conclusion is they don't go up and down together at exactly the same time. The prey goes up and down before the predator. Okay, first term you have to know. This is a numerical response. This is a numerical response by the predator. The numerical response refers to the fact that if prey numbers go up, predator numbers go up. And if prey numbers go down, predator numbers go down. And we see a functional response in instances, it would look classically like this. We would see a close link between the predator numbers and the prey numbers. What reasons can you think that this might not work out? That it might not, in nature we might not, I mean we saw it here with lynx and snowshoe hare for decades and decades and decades. Why in the real world is this so unusual? Yeah, you're only going to see this if you have a prey whose principal predator is one species and vice versa. It's not true here. Snowshoe hare are also fed on by hawks and by great horned owl, but apparently those are minor levels of predation relative to the predation from the lynx. The other thing that's not true about this, than people have noticed, is that there's a 10-year cycle. Lots of 10-year cycles in nature, people have tried to occasionally successfully tie to sunspot activity. It kind of goes like this. There is something like a 15 to 12-year cycle of sunspots. And when there's sunspot activity, we get reduced sunlight, which can actually cause a reduction in plant growth. So sometimes when we see natural cycles that appear to be on something like a 10-year cycle, it's a logical thing to try to see if you can link those with sunspots. Don't waste your time trying to do it now, because climate change swamps any effect we might be able to see that really exists from some sunspots is swamped by what's going on because of climate change. So I would say that since probably the 1960s, but certainly since the 80s, the likelihood you're going to be able to show any relationship is vanishingly small. And that actually is an important principle, if I can make this as an aside. Small errors don't matter until large errors are removed. That sounds intuitive, but I can tell you guys, I see that mistake constantly. And I especially see it sometimes with graduate students who will waste time trying to remove small errors while they have these massive errors that are screwing up their data. And they're wasting their time. Small errors don't matter. It's kind of this same, small effects are not really significant if they're being swamped out by a large effect. Okay. In the case of the snowshoe hares, it appears there's been a lot of studies done on food and food availability. And it appears that they don't die from malnutrition, but it is also true that their populations do vary slightly based upon food quality. And so, what's the story between food quality and predation, do you suppose? It's what you might think. If you're not well fed, you have a higher likelihood of being eaten. And so, that's a classic interaction between the amount of food a prey item has and the likelihood that a given prey will be selected. So it's one of the arenas where we think that initially people argued that snowshoe hare and lynx were a two-factor. They would say two trophic levels, trophic feeding levels. One level's the hare, the second level is the lynx. But in reality, it's a three-level system because whatever the plants are and their condition sort of sets a base for the snowshoe hare populations. And even though the food quality doesn't kill them, it does influence how many die, particularly during the winter, where they're stressed, they have to look for more food, and then they become more vulnerable to predators. Okay? Now, let's pause here and ask ourselves, if that's the first classic example of predator-prey, what's the second classic example that I'm going to talk to you about? And I'll give you a hint, it's also North America. Yes, of course, it's wolves and moose, well done, on Isle Royal. And let's see, where did I put that? Here we go. Gosh, how do I make that chart bigger? That's not there. Well, you're going to have to work with me. Oh, that's okay. All right, there's a comparable chart for moose and wolves on Isle Royal. You guys know about Isle Royal? Isle Royal is an island that exists in Lake Superior. It is, in the United States, it's American. It belongs to the state of Michigan, which makes no sense at all because it's much closer to Minnesota. I backpacked on Isle Royal, which is an interesting experience. And we took a ferry from Duluth, or just north of Duluth, Minnesota, to go there. I highly recommend it, but when you backpack in a national park, but at least in Isle Royal, you only could use established sites. So there were a couple of, I just remember this long march over a swamp for like 2.5 miles or 2 miles on nothing but boardwalks. And with a backpack, that got old, man. But it's a cool place. What you see is that the moose populations do show the general trend that we would expect, right? It's not as clean as with the snowshoe hares, but we see, and I don't know if you know the story, but wolves on Isle Royal, the island was without wolves until a very heavy freeze in the 40s. A pack of wolves came across the ice, established there. There'd not been another freeze as great, so the wolves were basically locked in. And over the years of study, those roughly 40 years, what we see that as the wolf population increased, the moose population, particularly when the wolves start to spike, will decrease. Notice this lag. The moose start going down here while the wolves are still going up. That's right, that's what happens. You'll see the predators continue to go up, and then as the prey base diminishes, they will lag behind. So that's not a surprise, and it's not a function necessarily in a single year. Similarly, as we see this crash in wolf populations, we see this huge increase in moose populations until the wolves finally come back up and there's a crash. My suspicion is that that's not strictly due to wolves. I'll bet there was disease or a second factor operating there because it's too fast to crash, from my opinion. And I don't know anything about this, so I'm speaking just off the top of my head, right? Now, the current situation on Isle Royal is interesting. I double-checked, and as of March, it appears there's only a single wolf. Inbreeding depression. There were so few wolves, and let me go ahead and introduce this term. You'll hear me say it again when we talk about conservation biology. We could say bad luck, and that would be a great term to use in biology, but of course we don't. What we say is stochastic event. What does stochastic event mean? Bad luck. It means something random happened. And here's the context in which it's used. When population levels are very low, specifically when population levels, say, are below that lower extinction level, it's not so much that they necessarily drop to zero right away, but they're very, very vulnerable to a stochastic event. So what's a stochastic event? One bad winter. One period of extended rain and the food I have to eat happened to disappear. Most years I could find something else, a few would survive, but the numbers are too low. So
What was the name of the term again?
stochastic, it's in your book if you don't, but I'm not so concerned you know that other than recognizing, but basically it's a random event. Something random happens that's bad. And small populations are always more vulnerable to that than large populations. The current plan, as I understand it, and I think it said so in this article, I'll post a link to this. The current plan is to reintroduce either one or two breeding pairs of wolves. What's happening on Isle Royale? Oh, it's horrible. The moose are driving themselves to extinction by overpopulation. They're destroying the plants, they're destroying everything, and that's a big issue when you look at population regulation. If one factor doesn't bring down the population, something else will. But in an ecosystem like an island, it's altogether possible for a species essentially to destroy the environment through overpopulation and then not be able to come back. And that's the same argument people will make about humans. In fact, you could make, and people have made, a legitimate argument that increasing agricultural productivity to feed everybody on the planet may be a very bad thing. Why? Because if everybody's fed, the population would continue to increase, and then we would be driven to extinction by a different event. Therefore, from a utilitarian standpoint, that's unethical. From a Kantian standpoint, you have to do it. We'll talk a little bit about that, not as much as I might like, when we talk about conservation biology. But it's not a theoretical argument because we can see it happening in other species. And Isle Royale is a nice little ecological experiment that shows how this can occur. Okay. I mentioned that functional response, and I got everything backwards. I told you functional, I should have said numerical. The two responses are functional and numerical responses. I believe I said functional, didn't I? I said numerical? Oh, I didn't screw up. What a joy. Okay, the second response is numerical, or is functional, excuse me. Numerical, the numbers, you had a lot of prey, you get a lot to eat, you have a lot of babies. Functional response, it only costs $4 to go to the all-you-can-eat buffet. And they've got little ribeye steaks. Or they have, my favorite dessert as a child, cream-filled eclairs. So you just eat as many of those things as you possibly can. A functional response is not a change in numbers of the predator, it's a change in how the predator acts. And specifically, what happens with a functional response is that when prey are abundant, the predator kills more of that kind of prey. And you could say, well, look, if there's a lot of the prey, they're just going to randomly find them, so naturally they'll kill more. No. What I'm saying is they kill more, even accounting for the fact that the prey are more abundant. A classic functional response would be for a predator to kill prey it can't eat.
Do they take it back to like the save the predator?
Depends on the predator. I've seen insects just kill because they've got a kill switch and they can't apparently turn off. There's a lot of behaviors that are called, there's a lot of behaviors organisms have that will be called having a hyperstimulus. And I wish I could tell you humans are immune to this, but we are not. So a defect in behavior occurs when you have a trigger that starts a behavior, but the triggers that end the behavior or the things that end the behavior don't operate very well. So a good example of this with lions are the lions of Savo, which in the early 1900s started killing railway workers. Now the lions it got to the point they were not eating, they barely ate any of their victims. Essentially, they had some normal behavior, but they found a prey that was easy. They formed a prey image on that, and then for whatever reason, they couldn't turn that behavior off and just went nuts. There's speculation that a similar phenomenon happens with sexual predators in humans, like serial rapists, that they have a behavior, say a normal I shouldn't say normal, but there's a normal behavior, some sort of modest degree of sexual aggression, which would be associated with normal mating behaviors. And whatever the limitations of that are, for whatever reasons, are taken away. We know that it's not strictly genetic, that there's a genetic environmental cues. The same applies for serial killers. And so there's a series of behaviors that occur in lots of organisms that once started, apparently, there can be aberrant conditions that they don't turn off. Sometimes those conditions aren't aberrant. Sometimes in simpler organisms, you can have a signal that's just so strong that they've never been selected against. So my example of this is the beetle in Australia that started mating with beer bottles and preferred beer bottles to females of its own species. It used color and texture as key sexual stimuli, and the beer bottle was better with those stimuli than the real female. Weird, right? But that's kind of what people worry is going to happen as soon as they have sex robots. And hey, if that reduces population numbers, go at it, or whatever the appropriate term is. I've got no problem with it. Just get those numbers down. Okay.
Aberrant? What does that mean?
Aberrant? Aberrant means not normal. And it also has the connotation of not normal and probably not good. You can have aberrant behaviors like grown men who just live to play D&D every Friday night, engage in retention of juvenile characteristics or juvenile behaviors in the adult. That's unusual, but it's not necessarily aberrant unless they made their whole class. If you want to get an A in this class, you have to play Dungeons and Dragons and demonstrate to me that you can get your character to level 4. That would be aberrant, right? So typically, I think a formal definition of aberrant psychologically has something to do, it has to significantly interfere with daily life to be qualified that way. I would say in ecology, what we would likely say is an aberrant behavior is one that would lead to selection against it. It would be sufficiently bad that there would be negative selection. Okay? The last thing I want to do is basically quickly run through a slideshow just to illustrate a couple things that I think you should know. So let's do that. And guess what taxa I chose for this? Now, the Predator from the Predator movies is a classic example of a species that has a huge functional response issue. It doesn't need to kill every crewman, it needs only a few to lay those eggs in. The adults should be feeding on the prey, they're not. And really what this is an example of, what they are, their life cycle, if you've seen the movies, they take them to a female and she lays eggs in these. That's actually a form of predation that's called, and dear God, don't write this horrible word down, parasitoid I'm going to get it. Bear with me. Parasitoidization. So having a parasite that kills its host, the term for that parasite is parasitoid. And it's not really a parasite at all. If it kills its host, that makes it a predator. So parasites that kill their host are really a form of predator. And so the predator should really be the parasitoid. Yeah, except that sometimes they kill their host too, so I don't know what to say about that. Let's look at some examples here. I mentioned this. One of the standard ways that all sorts of organisms protect themselves from lynx and other horrible predators is through crowding. These are I was trying to think of the common name. These are bark lice. They're in their own order of insects. And I saw these when I was in Brazil, and I'm embarrassed to say I stood there for 20 minutes trying to say, what the heck are you? It took me the longest time to figure out what they were. And it's because I never had seen them communally. I'd never seen them just laying on. It was just completely out of context. You notice they have these long antennae. I know why they have that. They overlap, so if a wasp or something comes to start feeding on them, they'll run around and try to disturb it. Another example of this occurs with lots of caterpillars that will move and have communal moving groups, because they tend to overwhelm predators. It's hard for predators to get a single search image. These are from I don't know what species, or excuse me, I don't know what family this is. These are actually from a walk I took north of Manaus in rainforest, and so is the next one. So a lot of these sorts of communal behaviors are protection against all kinds of predators. These guys were neat. I got in trouble with Addison. He was really upset that I was getting close to these wasps when I took the picture. And so I took these pictures, I moved a little bit away, and our guide, actually was the father-in-law of our guide, was a cassava farmer. He took a stick and hit the leaf to have these guys swarm all up. And we took off, and I heard him laughing in the back. Apparently he was familiar enough with them, they would only fly 1.5 meters away before they got apparently worried that they had a behavior that we'd go back. So they'd fly about 1.5 meters out to sting something, but then they would come back. We didn't know the difference. That was during the day. The dark background is because I used a flash, Kelly, which I kind of had to do as dark as the rainforest was. The insect version of a lion is sort of the tiger beetle, which are visual move to form their search image and so forth. Another good example of these sorts of visual predators are mantids. I also put a mantid in here because species that are ambush predators will often be cryptic against their background. And if you reflect a little bit on vertebrate predators, that's true. It's as true for many vertebrate predators as it is for insect predators. Another feature of predators is that it's great for a predator to be much bigger than the prey. And if you can't be much bigger than a prey, then feed on your prey communally, so the group is bigger. Why? Because you don't want the prey to kill you. And you want it to be easily handled so you can go ahead and just deal with it.
So if you practice a colony or communally, does that mean everyone gets a share of the food then?
Yeah, and it's not surprising. You'll see a lot of hierarchical organizations. So canids do this. Some felines do this. And then you'll have an alpha male or female. You'll go through that. Many of the insect predators are, not surprising, they're not communal because they don't have the intelligence to do that. It's pretty much limited to the social insects, which is another reason they have an advantage. And I wanted to point out with this photograph a couple things. One, I don't know what this looks like to you, but this is a robber fly feeding on a leaf-feeding insect. This is it's called a leaf hopper. It has piercing, sucking mouth parts. It looks like it's on a bed of salt because it's on a bed of salt. This is up at Arbor Lake on the salt flats. And it took me crawling minutes chasing this robber fly. I got a good idea that the robber fly just wanted to eat, and if I badgered it enough, it would become used to me. But I literally burnt my elbows. It was like 135 on that sand when I was doing this. Totally worth it for the shot. Okay, besides that little story, what did I want to say? Notice this beard, all these hairs, that's actually to help prevent the eyes and face from being damaged by flailing prey items. It uses its front legs to form a basket, and it can take prey as small as this, as it is. And notice something too about how it's killed this prey item. This is its stylet head. That's the head of the insect. So it's someplace in between those two. It's actually piercing the cervix. With insects, they have a membranous cervix, the neck, the piece that connects the head to the thorax. So where do lions and predatory cats like to attack their prey? It's all the same thing. They evolved to attack a particularly vulnerable spot, but more than that, it's not just a vulnerable spot, it's a spot where if they're successful, they kill the prey quickly or they render the prey unable to escape or to damage them. What do we learn from this? When the shark is attacking you, you should fight. Occasionally, predators are disturbed by prey that fight because it's too much work and they run the risk of getting hurt. Not as effective with really big sharks, needless to say. Okay, another strategy, which is an expansion of the ambush strategy, is sit and wait. For spiders, you can see what the big thing they did is they basically expand the area from which they can get prey. And it's hardly a surprise that spiders make a lot of toxins because what's the function of those toxins? Immediately render the prey helpless. Secondarily, they may act as a protection for the spider itself, but the two traits go hand in hand. Larvae of tiger beetles look like, and you'll often hear me say I think they have the dumbest life history strategy of arguably any organism I've heard of. They live in pits. This head here, with the mandibles down, is all you can see. There's little hooks back here, and they wait for stuff to walk by and then grab it and pull it into the nest. The pointer doesn't, my cursor isn't working? Isn't it on there? No, it's not working there, sorry. Okay, so you see the head. If you come down, you see there's a brown oval. That's a sclera. If you come down, you can see where the abdomen looks like it swells. Well, where it's swelling, there are actually a pair of hooks that it hooks into its burrow in case it grabs onto something too big. I think it's a stupid way to make a living. They're a very old group, and I would like somebody to explain to me how that can be ecologically successful. And you know what? Let's stop there, and next time we will start with cryptic coloration.